The year is 1743. On the northern coast of Saint-Domingue, the Caribbean island that will one day be called Haiti, a baby is born in a wooden shack with a dirt floor on the Breda sugar plantation. His mother is an enslaved African woman. His father is an enslaved African man. The baby has no legal identity. He has no rights. Under French colonial law, he is not a person. He is property, movable goods, listed on the same inventory as the plantation's cattle, its tools, and its sugar processing equipment. His estimated value at birth is approximately 500 French livres, less than the price of a good horse. The plantation owner records the birth the way he records the birth of livestock. One male, healthy, born to field slave. The child is given a name that will appear on no official document, carry no legal weight, and matter to no one in power. Toussaint. A small name for a small piece of property in the largest wealth-generating machine the world has ever seen. But here's what the plantation ledger doesn't record. This baby, this piece of property worth less than a horse, will grow up to command armies of 50,000 men. He will defeat the soldiers of 3 European empires. He will outsmart the most brilliant military mind of the 19th century. He will liberate an entire nation. And he will force Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered Europe, to abandon an entire hemisphere in humiliation and fury. This is the story of Toussaint Louverture, the slave who became a general, the general who broke an empire, and the man whose revolution changed the world in ways that are still being felt today. But it's also the story of what the world did to punish the people he freed. And that part of the story is something that nobody wants you to know. To understand what Toussaint Louverture accomplished, you first need to understand what Saint-Domingue was in the 18th century, and what it was defies the imagination. By 1789, Saint-Domingue was the single most profitable colony on the face of the earth. Not one of the most profitable, the most profitable. This one island, roughly the size of Maryland, produced more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined. It generated 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe. It produced 60% of the world's coffee. Its exports were worth more than everything that Britain imported from its entire colonial empire. The wealth was staggering. My French merchants who invested in Saint-Domingue plantations became rich beyond imagination. The port cities of Nantes and Bordeaux were built on sugar money. The grand townhouses that still line their streets today were financed by the labor of enslaved Africans working and dying on Caribbean plantations 6,000 miles away. Voltaire wrote about it. Adam Smith analyzed it. The entire French economy was structurally dependent on the continued profitability of this single island. But that profitability came at a cost that most people in Paris preferred not to think about. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue held approximately 500,000 enslaved Africans. The conditions they endured were among the worst in the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. And the history of the Atlantic slave trade was a competition in horror, where sugar production was uniquely brutal. The planting season was backbreaking. The harvest season was worse. And the processing of raw sugarcane into exportable sugar required work around boiling vats, spinning machinery, and industrial equipment that mutilated and killed workers with a regularity that plantation owners simply factored into their operating costs. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person arriving in Saint-Domingue from Africa was 7 years. 7 years. That number is not a misprint. The conditions were so lethal that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. The colony required a constant influx of newly kidnapped Africans just to maintain its workforce. Between 1780 and 1790, French slave ships delivered approximately 40,000 new captives to Saint-Domingue every single year. Now 40,000 people per year imported to replace the people who had been worked to death the previous year. The plantation owners knew this. They had done the mathematics. It was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to improve conditions enough to extend their productive lives. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though there was plenty of that too. It was a business model built on the principle that African lives were a consumable resource, like firewood or lamp oil, to be used up and replaced as needed. Into this world of calculated horror, Toussaint grew up on the Breda plantation. But his experience was unusual among the enslaved population. unusual enough that it would prove decisive for the future of the entire Western Hemisphere. The Breda plantation was managed by a man named Toussaint Louverture, who was, by the standards of Saint-Domingue's planter class, relatively moderate in his treatment of enslaved people. This is not to say he was humane. Owning human beings is not a spectrum on which moderation earns moral credit. But de Louverture recognized that Toussaint was intelligent, and he allowed a Catholic priest on the plantation to teach the boy to read and write. This was extraordinarily rare. Literacy among the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue was actively suppressed by law and custom. The colonial authorities understood instinctively what Frederick Douglass would later articulate explicitly. Literacy is the pathway from slavery to freedom. An enslaved person who could read could access dangerous ideas, could communicate secretly, could organize, could plan. Toussaint didn't just learn to read French, he devoured everything he could find. He learned Latin from the priest. He read the classical military histories, studying the campaigns of Julius Caesar, the tactics of Alexander the Great, the strategies of Hannibal. He read the French Enlightenment philosophers, absorbing their arguments about natural rights, about the fundamental equality of human beings, about the illegitimacy of tyranny. He read everything about military organization, logistics, and command that he could access, and he kept all of it hidden behind the mask of a quiet, loyal, unremarkable enslaved man who tended the plantation's livestock and caused no trouble. For 48 years, Toussaint lived this double life. Outwardly, he was what the plantation system required him to be: obedient, invisible, property that didn't cause problems. Inwardly, he was something else entirely. He was studying, he was preparing, he was waiting for something he couldn't yet name, but would recognize the instant it arrived. By the time he reached middle age, Toussaint had been granted a position of relative privilege on the Breda plantation. He managed the livestock, a position of trust that gave him freedom of movement across the plantation and regular contact with enslaved people on neighboring estates. He had been granted a small plot of land to cultivate. He had even been allowed to lease enslaved people himself, a complexity in his biography that historians have debated for generations. He was also developing a reputation among the enslaved community that went far beyond his official status. Toussaint knew herbal medicine. He treated the sick when the plantation's medical resources, such as they were, proved inadequate. He advised people on disputes. He served as an unofficial counselor, mediator, and leader within the enslaved community. People called him the doctor. They trusted him. They came to him with their problems, their fears, and eventually, as conditions worsened and talk of resistance spread through the enslaved population, like fire through dry cane fields, they came to him with their plans. Through all of this, Toussaint waited. He was 48 years old when the waiting finally ended. 48 years of silence, 48 years of observation, 48 years of reading Caesar and Alexander by candlelight while the world treated him as furniture. And then in August 1791, the Caribbean night erupted in flame, when Toussaint Louverture stepped out of the shadows and into history. The spark that ignited the Haitian Revolution didn't come from Toussaint. It came from a man named Dutty Boukman, a Vodou priest and overseer on a plantation in the north of the colony. On the night of August 14, 1791, Boukman led a religious ceremony in a clearing called Bois Caïman, in the forested hills above the northern plain. The ceremony was Vodou, the spiritual tradition that enslaved Africans had preserved and adapted from their ancestral religions, despite brutal colonial efforts to suppress it. What happened at Bois Caïman was both spiritual ritual and military planning session. Boukman, a massive man with a commanding presence, addressed the assembled enslaved people in Creole, in the language that the colonial system had never bothered to learn, and therefore could never effectively monitor. The exact words have been preserved through oral tradition, though they vary across accounts. The God who created the sun, which gives us light, who rouses the waves and rules the storm, he is hidden in the clouds, but he watches us. He sees all that the white man does. The God of the white man inspires him with crime, but our God calls upon us to do good works. Our God, who is good to us, orders us to take revenge. He will direct our arms and aid us. Throw away the symbol of the God of the whites who has so often caused us to weep, and listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of us all. Within hours of the ceremony, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue was on fire. Not metaphorically, literally. And the enslaved population rose simultaneously across hundreds of plantations. Cane fields that represented millions of livres worth of investment were set ablaze. Plantation houses that had been built on the profits of human suffering were reduced to ashes. The machinery of sugar production, the boiling houses, the mills, the presses, were smashed and burned. In a single night, the most profitable agricultural system in the world began to disintegrate. The scale of the uprising was unprecedented. Within days, 100,000 enslaved people had joined the revolt across the colony. Within weeks, virtually every plantation in the northern province had been destroyed or abandoned. The white planter class, which had spent generations building a society based on absolute control over a vast enslaved majority, discovered overnight that their control had been an illusion. They were 40,000 people surrounded by 500,000 who had decided simultaneously and irrevocably that they would rather die fighting than continue living as property. The violence was extraordinary on both sides. Enslaved people who had watched family members worked to death, beaten, raped, and tortured for generations, unleashed decades of accumulated rage. Plantation owners and their families were killed. Overseers who had built reputations for cruelty were hunted down. The colonial militia, when it could organize at all, responded with indiscriminate massacres that only intensified the revolt. And during these first chaotic, bloody days, Toussaint did something that revealed the character that would define his entire revolutionary career. Before joining the revolt, he arranged for the safe escape of the Breda Plantation's manager, Napoleon Bonaparte, and his family. He provided them with provisions, arranged transport, and ensured they reached safety in the colonial capital. The man who had owned him, the family that had treated him as property, he saved their lives. This wasn't weakness, this wasn't Stockholm Syndrome, this was strategy. Toussaint understood something that the other rebel leaders, in the fury of liberation, had not yet grasped. This revolution would eventually need to negotiate with the outside world. A revolution remembered for indiscriminate massacre would be isolated and destroyed. A revolution led by a man capable of mercy, of discipline, of strategic thinking beyond the immediate satisfaction of vengeance might survive. Only after the Breda family was safe did Toussaint join the revolution. And when he joined, he didn't join as a foot soldier. He arrived with a plan, with knowledge accumulated over 48 years of secret study, and with a vision for what this uprising could become if it was led by someone who understood not just how to fight, but how to win. The early months of the revolution were chaos. Multiple rebel factions fought the colonial forces and sometimes each other. Leaders emerged and fell. Boukman himself was killed in battle in November 1791, just 3 months after lighting the fire he had started. The colonial authorities displayed his head on a stake in the central square of Cap Français with a sign that read, "This is the head of Boukman, chief of the rebels." They meant it as a warning. It became a rallying cry. Toussaint initially allied himself with the Spanish, who controlled the eastern portion of the island and saw an opportunity to weaken their French rivals by supporting the rebellion. Under Spanish patronage, Toussaint received weapons, supplies, and the freedom to organize his forces as he saw fit. What he built was extraordinary. From the undisciplined mass of formerly enslaved rebels, Toussaint created a functioning army. He imposed military discipline on men who had never held weapons before. He organized supply lines through the mountainous interior of the island. He established a command structure with clear chains of authority. He drilled his soldiers in European military formations while also developing guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to the island's terrain. His methods were demanding. Deserters were executed. Discipline was maintained through a combination of personal charisma, shared purpose, and the understanding that failure meant re-enslavement. But Toussaint also earned his soldiers' loyalty through competence. He won battles. He outmaneuvered European-trained officers. He demonstrated again and again that a formerly enslaved man who had spent his life reading Caesar by candlelight could outthink professional soldiers who had attended the finest military academies in Europe. It was during this period that Toussaint acquired the surname that would make him immortal. Louverture, the opening. According to the most widely accepted account, a French officer who had been repeatedly outflanked by Toussaint's forces complained to a colleague that the man was impossible to contain. Every time we close a gap, he finds an opening. He always finds an opening. The name stuck. Toussaint Louverture, the man who always found a way through. His tactical abilities were extraordinary, but his strategic genius was even more impressive. Toussaint understood that the rebellion's survival depended on navigating the complex and shifting alliances between the European powers competing for control of the Caribbean. France, Spain, and Britain all had interests in Saint-Domingue. Each could be an ally or an enemy, depending on circumstances. Toussaint played them against each other with a sophistication that left European diplomats bewildered. When the French revolutionary government in Paris, desperate to retain control of the colony, issued a decree abolishing slavery in all French territories in 1794, Toussaint made a calculated decision that stunned everyone. He switched sides. He abandoned his Spanish allies and declared his loyalty to France. Not because he trusted the French, not because he believed their commitment to abolition was sincere, but because alignment with France gave him legal standing. He was no longer a rebel. He was a French general defending French territory. His army was no longer an insurgency. It was the legitimate military force of the French Republic. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. In a single decision, Toussaint had transformed himself from an outlaw into an official, from a rebel into a governor, from a runaway slave into a French military commander with authority recognized by international law. The British found this out the hard way. In 1793, seeing an opportunity in the chaos of the French Revolution and the Saint-Domingue Rebellion, Britain invaded the colony. They sent an expeditionary force of professional soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, equipped with the finest weapons the British Empire could provide. They expected to crush the slave rebellion quickly and add the world's most profitable sugar colony to Britain's Caribbean holdings. What they encountered instead was Toussaint Louverture. The British campaign in Saint-Domingue lasted 5 years. 5 years of mounting casualties, strategic frustration, and military humiliation. Toussaint didn't fight the British the way they expected to be fought. He refused to meet them in the open field battles where their training and equipment gave them overwhelming advantages. Instead, he waged a guerrilla campaign that exploited everything the British couldn't adapt to: the mountains. Toussaint's forces knew every path, every valley, every ridgeline in the interior of the island. British units that pursued rebel forces into the mountains found themselves ambushed in terrain so dense and steep that their formations dissolved into chaos. Supply columns were attacked. Outposts were raided at night and abandoned by morning. Officers were picked off by sharpshooters who seemed to materialize from the jungle, fire a single shot, and vanish. The climate. Saint-Domingue's tropical heat and disease environment devastated the British forces with a lethality that no enemy army could match. Yellow fever alone killed thousands of British soldiers. Men who had survived battlefields across Europe died in their barracks from a disease they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. At the height of the occupation, the British were losing more soldiers to disease each month than Toussaint was losing in combat in an entire year. Toussaint used the disease as a weapon. He deliberately prolonged engagements during the rainy season when yellow fever transmission was highest. He avoided decisive battles that would risk his own forces, preferring instead to keep the British deployed in the field where the mosquitoes could do his work for him. It was callous, brilliant, and devastatingly effective. The defining engagement came in 1798 near the town of Mirebalais in the Central Mountains. A British force of 1,500 soldiers, including seasoned regulars from Irish and Scottish regiments, was tasked with clearing rebel forces from a strategically vital mountain pass. The British commander, Colonel Thomas Brisbane, was an experienced officer who had studied the terrain and planned his approach carefully. What Brisbane didn't know was that Toussaint had anticipated his exact route of advance 3 weeks earlier. Rebel engineers had spent those 3 weeks preparing the pass. Trees had been felled across the narrowest points. Trenches had been dug into the hillsides. False trails had been created to draw British scouts into dead ends. And on both sides of the pass, concealed behind natural rock formations and dense vegetation, Toussaint had positioned 4,000 of his best fighters. Brisbane's column entered the pass in the early morning, moving cautiously but confidently. The vanguard cleared the first fallen tree without incident. The column compressed as it navigated around a second obstacle, and then the pass erupted. A gunfire poured from both hillsides simultaneously. The British soldiers, trapped in a narrow corridor with obstacles in front and behind, couldn't form their defensive squares. They couldn't see their attackers. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear above the continuous roar of musketry echoing off the canyon walls. Toussaint's fighters used the terrain with lethal precision. They fired from prepared positions, fell back to secondary positions when the British attempted to charge uphill, and then reoccupied their original positions the moment the British withdrew. Every attempt to break out of the kill zone cost the British dozens of casualties. Every pause allowed Toussaint's sharpshooters to pick off officers and sergeants, systematically dismantling the command structure of the trapped column. After 6 hours of continuous fighting, Brisbane ordered a retreat. His force had lost over 300 men killed and wounded. Toussaint's casualties were fewer than 40. The pass remained in rebel hands, and the British forces in Saint-Domingue received a lesson that their generals would reluctantly acknowledge in their reports to London. They were not fighting an insurgency. They were fighting an army, led by a general who was, by any honest assessment, their equal or superior in tactical ability. By 1798, Britain had had enough. After 5 years of campaigning, after losing over 20,000 soldiers, most of them to disease after spending millions of pounds sterling on a war that produced nothing but casualties and embarrassment, Britain withdrew from Saint-Domingue. They negotiated their departure not with the French colonial government, which had effectively ceased to exist, but with Toussaint Louverture. A former slave negotiated the withdrawal of the British Empire from Caribbean territory. The significance of that fact was not lost on anyone involved. By 1800, Toussaint was the undisputed ruler of Saint-Domingue. He held the title of Governor-General, technically still within the framework of the French Republic, but in practice exercising absolute authority over the colony. He had defeated the Spanish. He had driven out the British. He had suppressed rival factions within the rebel movement, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through force. He controlled the entire island, including the Spanish-speaking eastern portion. And then he did something that was either the bravest or the most dangerous act of his career. He wrote a constitution. The Constitution of 1801 declared that all people in Saint-Domingue were free and equal regardless of color. It abolished slavery permanently. It established Toussaint as Governor-General for life with the power to name his own successor. It maintained nominal French sovereignty while granting the colony complete autonomy in its internal affairs. And it opened the colony's ports to trade with all nations, breaking France's monopoly on Saint-Domingue's commerce. When a copy of the Constitution reached Paris, it landed on the desk of a man who had just crowned himself the most powerful ruler in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte read it and flew into a rage that witnesses described as terrifying. 6,000 miles from the Caribbean, in a palace that gleamed with stolen gold and imperial pretension, Napoleon Bonaparte stared at the document that a former slave had dared to send him and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling: helplessness. Napoleon was not a man who tolerated defiance from anyone, let alone from someone he considered inherently inferior. His views on race were explicit and documented. He had reinstated slavery in the French colonies of Guadeloupe and Martinique. He had declared publicly that he would never leave the colony's most important resources in the hands of black people. He viewed Toussaint's constitution not merely as a political challenge, but as an affront to the natural order of the world as he understood it. But Napoleon's fury went beyond racism, though racism was certainly at its foundation. Saint-Domingue was the financial engine that Napoleon needed to fund his continental ambitions. Without the revenue from the colony's sugar and coffee exports, his plans for European domination would be starved of capital. Moreover, Saint-Domingue was the cornerstone of Napoleon's vision for a new French empire in the Western Hemisphere. He intended to use the colony as a base for establishing French control over the Louisiana Territory, the vast region in North America that France had recently reacquired from Spain. Toussaint's constitution threatened all of this. An autonomous Saint-Domingue that traded freely with all nations would never generate the monopoly profits that Napoleon's plans required. A colony governed by former slaves would never serve as a staging ground for the re-imposition of slavery across the French Caribbean. Toussaint had to be removed, and slavery had to be restored. In late 1801, Napoleon assembled the largest naval expedition that France had ever sent across the Atlantic Ocean. 40,000 soldiers, 86 ships. Command was given to General Charles Leclerc, who happened to be Napoleon's brother-in-law, married to Napoleon's sister Pauline. It was the most formidable military force that had ever been directed at a Caribbean target, and its orders were clear. Remove Toussaint from power, restore French authority, and restore slavery, though this last objective was to be kept secret until the military situation was secure. Napoleon gave Leclerc specific instructions about how to handle the situation. First, be friendly. Reassure Toussaint and his generals that France had no intention of restoring slavery. Promise amnesty. Promise continued freedom. Promise anything necessary to get the rebel generals to lower their guard. Then, once the military situation was favorable, arrest the rebel leaders, disarm the population, and reimpose the old order. It was a plan built on deception, overwhelming force, and racist contempt for the intelligence of the people it was designed to subjugate. Napoleon genuinely believed that 40,000 professional European soldiers would sweep aside a slave army without significant difficulty. He was catastrophically wrong. When the French fleet appeared on the horizon of Saint-Domingue in January 1802, the sight was terrifying. 86 ships stretching across the Caribbean Sea, the largest naval force any living person on the island had ever seen. Toussaint's generals, watching from the shore, understood immediately what this armada represented. And Henri Christophe, the commander of the northern port city of Cap Français, sent a message to the approaching fleet. He would not surrender the city without direct orders from Toussaint. The French demanded immediate entry. Christophe's response was to set his own city on fire. The burning of Cap Français was one of the most dramatic acts of the entire revolution. Rather than allow the richest city in the Caribbean to fall intact into French hands, Christophe ordered its destruction. Warehouses filled with sugar and coffee went up in flames. Mansions that had taken decades to build were reduced to ash in hours. The message was unmistakable. You cannot take what no longer exists. If France wanted Saint-Domingue, they would have to fight for every inch of scorched earth. Toussaint's strategy against the French invasion drew on everything he had learned in a decade of warfare. He knew he couldn't defeat 40,000 professional soldiers in open battle. His army was experienced but outnumbered, and the French troops were among the best in Europe, veterans of Napoleon's Italian and Egyptian campaigns. A conventional war would be suicide, so Toussaint chose an unconventional war. He ordered a strategic withdrawal into the mountainous interior, the same terrain that had swallowed the British Expeditionary Force years earlier. He implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying anything of economic value that might fall into French hands. Plantations were burned, bridges were demolished, roads were blocked, water sources were poisoned. The French would find nothing to sustain their army and no infrastructure to support their occupation. The early months of the French campaign followed a pattern that Leclerc found increasingly frustrating. His forces could take any position they targeted. They had the firepower and the discipline to push rebel forces out of any defensive position, but they couldn't hold territory. Every town they captured was empty, stripped of anything useful. Every road they advanced along was harassed by guerrilla fighters who attacked, inflicted casualties, and disappeared before the French could bring their superior numbers to bear. Every night, sentries were killed. Every supply column was ambushed. Every French victory was hollow because there was nothing left to win. And then the rains came, and with the rains came the mosquitoes. And with the mosquitoes came yellow fever. Toussaint had planned for this. He knew from the British experience that European soldiers had virtually no resistance to tropical diseases. He knew that the rainy season, beginning in May, would turn Saint-Domingue into a death trap for unacclimated Europeans. His entire strategy was designed to keep the French army deployed in the field through the rainy season, exposed to conditions that would kill them more efficiently than any weapon. The yellow fever epidemic that struck the French army in the summer of 1802 was apocalyptic. Soldiers who had survived the battlefields of Europe died in their thousands from a disease they couldn't see and couldn't fight. Hospitals overflowed. Burial details couldn't keep pace with the dead. Leclerc wrote desperate letters to Napoleon describing the catastrophe. "I have lost 160 officers in a single month," he reported. "My army is being devoured by disease. Send reinforcements or we are lost." Napoleon sent reinforcements. The disease consumed them too. But before the disease could complete its work, the French achieved one devastating success. Through a combination of diplomatic deception and military pressure, they lured Toussaint into a peace negotiation. Leclerc sent assurances of safety. He promised that Toussaint would retain his freedom and his property. He suggested that a peaceful resolution would spare further bloodshed. He offered terms that seemed reasonable. Toussaint agreed to meet. On June 7, 1802, he rode to the meeting point with a small escort. What he found was not a negotiation, it was a trap. French soldiers surrounded his party. Toussaint was seized, bound in chains, and thrown into the hold of a ship bound for France. The man who had defeated the armies of 3 European empires was captured not in battle, but through betrayal. As the French soldiers dragged him aboard the ship, Toussaint turned to his captors and spoke words that would prove prophetic beyond anything he could have imagined. "In overthrowing me, you have done no more than cut down the trunk of the tree of black liberty in Saint-Domingue. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep." The French brought Toussaint to Fort de Joux, a medieval fortress perched on a frozen cliff in the Jura Mountains of eastern France. It was as far from the Caribbean as geography could provide. The cell they gave him was cold, dark, and deliberately designed to kill slowly. Napoleon gave specific orders regarding Toussaint's treatment: no adequate food, no adequate clothing, no adequate heat, no communication with the outside world. The message was clear. This man would die in this cell, and he would die slowly enough to feel every moment of it. Toussaint endured the freezing alpine winter in a stone cell with no fireplace. A man who had spent his entire life in tropical heat was subjected to temperatures below freezing as a deliberate instrument of murder. He was given starvation rations. He was denied medical care as his health deteriorated. He was interrogated repeatedly about hidden wealth and military plans, questions he answered with dignified silence or deflection. On April 7, 1803, a guard opened the door to Toussaint's cell and found him dead. Knowing he was seated in a chair beside the cold fireplace, still wearing the remnants of his military uniform. He was 59 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia and malnutrition. The actual cause was Napoleon Bonaparte, who had decided that if he couldn't defeat this man on the battlefield, he would murder him in a freezing cell and call it natural causes. But Toussaint's prophecy was already coming true, and Napoleon was about to discover that cutting down the trunk had only made the roots grow faster. If you're still here, then you understand that this isn't just a story about the past. It's about how power works, how freedom is won, and what it costs. Subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because someone has to. Back in Saint-Domingue, Toussaint's arrest had the opposite effect of what Napoleon intended. Instead of demoralizing the revolution, it radicalized it. The remaining rebel generals, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, understood now with absolute clarity that the French had no intention of honoring any agreement. There would be no negotiated peace. There would be no maintained freedom. The French had come to restore slavery, and they would use any deception necessary to achieve that goal. Dessalines was a different kind of leader than Toussaint. Where Toussaint had been strategic, patient, willing to negotiate, Dessalines was a force of pure, focused fury. He had been born into slavery. He bore scars across his entire body from the whippings he had endured as a child and young man. He hated the French with an intensity that went beyond politics into something primal and ungovernable. And he channeled that hatred into military effectiveness that terrified everyone who witnessed it. Under Dessalines, the revolution entered its most brutal phase. Quarter was neither asked nor given. French prisoners were killed. Plantations that had been rebuilt under Leclerc's occupation were burned again. Every engagement became a fight to the death. Dessalines' standing order to his troops was simple and absolute. We must live free or die. Christophe provided the strategic counterweight to Dessalines' fury. Where Dessalines attacked, Christophe planned. Where Dessalines inspired through rage, Christophe organized through discipline. Together, they formed a leadership partnership that, while lacking Toussaint's singular diplomatic genius, proved devastatingly effective as a military command team. And all the while, yellow fever continued its relentless destruction of the French army. By the fall of 1802, Leclerc himself was dying of the disease. He wrote his final letters to Napoleon in a delirium of fever and despair. "We must destroy all the black people in the mountains, men and women, and spare only children under 12 years of age. We must destroy half of those in the plains and leave not a single person of color in the colony who has worn an epaulet. Without this, the colony will never be at peace." It was the desperate prescription of a dying man who had discovered too late that the people he had been sent to re-enslave were willing to fight to the last person rather than submit. Leclerc died on November 2, 1802. He was 30 years old. His replacement, General Rochambeau, was even more brutal than Leclerc, importing Cuban hunting dogs to track down rebel fighters and conducting mass executions that only strengthened the revolution's determination. By late 1803, the French position in Saint-Domingue had become untenable. Of the 40,000 soldiers Napoleon had sent, fewer than 7,000 remained alive and capable of fighting. The rest were dead, primarily from disease. Reinforcements couldn't arrive fast enough to replace the losses. The rebel forces, now united under Dessalines' command, controlled virtually the entire colony. The French held only a few coastal positions, besieged from land, and increasingly cut off from naval support as the British, now at war with France and Europe, blockaded the Caribbean. On November 18, 1803, the final significant battle took place at Vertières, near the city of Cap Français. Dessalines launched a full assault against the last French defensive positions. The fighting was savage. French soldiers, many of them sick and all of them exhausted, fought with the courage of men who knew that surrender likely meant death. Dessalines' forces attacked with the fury of people fighting for something more fundamental than territory. They were fighting for the right to exist as human beings. The French line broke. Rochambeau negotiated a 10-day truce to evacuate his remaining forces. On November 30, 1803, the last French soldiers departed Saint-Domingue. They left behind an island of ashes, an army of ghosts, and a revolution that had accomplished the impossible. On January 1, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before the assembled people of the newly free nation and declared independence. When he renamed the country Haiti, reclaiming the indigenous Taino name for the island that European colonizers had erased. It was the first independent black republic in the history of the world, the first nation born from a successful slave revolution, the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, after only the United States. The Declaration of Haitian Independence was more than a political event. It was a philosophical earthquake. It declared, in blood and fire, and the bodies of 200,000 dead on all sides, that enslaved people were capable of liberating themselves, that black people could govern themselves, that the racial hierarchy on which the entire Atlantic economy was built was a lie enforced by violence, not a truth validated by nature. Every slaveholding power on earth understood the implications immediately. And every slaveholding power on earth responded with the same instinct. Haiti must be punished, not defeated militarily that had already been tried and failed, punished economically, diplomatically, and historically. Made into an example so devastating that no other enslaved population would ever dare to follow its lead. And the punishment began before the ink on the Declaration was dry. The newly independent Haiti found itself alone in a world that had every reason to want it to fail. The United States, itself a slave-holding republic, refused to recognize Haitian independence for nearly 60 years. American politicians understood that recognizing a nation founded by slave revolution would send a dangerous message to the millions of enslaved people in the American South. France demanded financial compensation for the loss of its colony and, more specifically, for the loss of its human property. In 1825, France sent a fleet of warships to Haiti and presented an ultimatum. Pay 150 million gold francs in reparations or face invasion and re-enslavement. Let that number settle in your mind. 150 million gold francs, the equivalent of approximately $21 billion in today's currency. And the reparations weren't being demanded from the former slaveholders. They were being demanded from the formerly enslaved. France was requiring the people it had kidnapped, tortured, worked to death, and treated as livestock to pay compensation to their former owners for the crime of freeing themselves. Haiti had no choice: pay or be destroyed. The young republic, its economy shattered by over a decade of continuous warfare, were its infrastructure reduced to ashes by scorched earth policies on both sides, its population decimated by combat and disease, agreed to pay. The debt was later reduced to 90 million francs, still an astronomical sum for a small Caribbean nation. Haiti borrowed the money from French banks at interest, creating a cycle of debt that would persist for over a century. The debt was not fully paid until 1947, 122 years. For 122 years, the wealth generated by Haitian labor flowed out of Haiti and into French banks. Schools that should have been built weren't built. Roads that should have been paved weren't paved. Hospitals that should have been staffed weren't staffed. An entire nation's development was arrested for over a century to pay reparations to people who had enslaved them. This is why Haiti is poor. It's not because of cultural failure, not because of governmental incompetence, though there has been plenty of that too, not because of any inherent inability to develop. Haiti is poor because the most powerful nations on earth decided that the price of freedom would be perpetual poverty, because the world looked at a nation of people who had accomplished the most extraordinary act of liberation in modern history and decided that they needed to be punished for it. Not for a year, not for a decade, for a century and a quarter. And Napoleon, the man who had sent 40,000 soldiers to their deaths in a failed attempt to re-enslave the people of Saint-Domingue, the disaster in Haiti convinced Napoleon that his dreams of a Western Hemisphere empire were finished. Without Saint-Domingue as a base, the Louisiana Territory was strategically useless. In 1803, the same year his army was being destroyed in the Caribbean, Napoleon sold the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, approximately 4 cents per acre. 828,000 square miles of territory, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, sold for less than what France had spent trying to reconquer a single island. The Haitian Revolution didn't just free Haiti, it doubled the size of the United States. It destroyed Napoleon's plans for a new world empire. It demonstrated, for the first time in modern history, that enslaved people could organize, fight, and defeat the most powerful military forces on earth. It inspired revolutionary movements across Latin America. Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America, received shelter, weapons, and support from Haiti in exchange for a single promise: that he would abolish slavery in every territory he freed. He kept that promise. Toussaint Louverture died alone in a freezing cell in the mountains of France, murdered by an emperor who considered him subhuman. He never saw the independence he had made possible. He never knew that his revolution would reshape the map of the Western Hemisphere. He never learned that the tree he had planted would grow roots so deep that no power on earth could pull them out. But he knew it would happen. He told them so. In overthrowing me, you have done no more than cut down the trunk of the tree of black liberty. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep. He was right. The roots held, the tree grew back, and the world has been trying to cut it down ever since. Toussaint Louverture was born as property. He lived as property for 48 years. He taught himself military strategy by candlelight. He freed himself, then freed a nation, then defeated an empire. He was betrayed, imprisoned, and murdered by a man who couldn't accept that a former slave had proven himself the superior strategist, the superior leader, and the superior human being. Haiti was punished for 122 years for the crime of believing that black people deserved to be free. That punishment continues in different forms today. Every time someone asks why Haiti is poor, the answer is not culture or governance or bad luck. The answer is that the world decided freedom should cost everything, and then spent a century and a quarter collecting the bill. The next time someone tells you that some people just aren't capable of governing themselves, remember Toussaint Louverture. Remember the man who read Caesar by candlelight in a slave shack and then outfought Napoleon? Remember the revolution that defeated the greatest military power in Europe with courage, strategy, and an absolute refusal to accept that any human being is another human being's property. And remember what the world did afterward, not because it's comfortable, but because it's true, and because the debt that history actually owes, the real debt, the debt owed to Haiti and to every descendant of every person who fought and died for the right to be free, that debt has never been paid, not 1 cent of it. If this story changed how you see history, if it made you angry, if it made you think, then share it. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because every week we're telling stories that the powerful would prefer you never heard. Stories about people who were supposed to stay silent, stay enslaved, stay forgotten. People who refused. And here's what I want to know from you. Drop it in the comments. What's the most important thing they never taught you in school? What piece of history was deliberately left out of your education? Because I guarantee you, there are more stories like Toussaint's out there. More truths that somebody decided you didn't need to know. Let's find them together.